What if I told you a single moment of terror killed the one person who could have saved Anne Boleyn from the executioner's blade?
On January 29th, 1536, while all of England buried Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn was losing something far more valuable.
A son, the future king.
The boy who would have made her untouchable.
100 days later, she was dead.
Beheaded.
Accused of crimes she never committed. But here's what they don't teach you in history class.
The miscarriage that sealed her fate wasn't just tragic.
It was the beginning of a calculated destruction. A conspiracy that would destroy 5 innocent people alongside her.
This is the story of how one lost pregnancy unraveled a queen, triggered a king's rage, and changed the course of English history forever.
Before we dive into the darkness, if you're fascinated by the brutal truths history tried to bury, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button.
These stories deserve to be remembered.
These voices deserve to be heard. And you being here, right now, keeps them alive.
Let's make sure Anne's truth isn't forgotten again.
Now, let me take you back to January 1536.
To the day everything changed.
The crowd at Greenwich Palace roared as 2 armoured figures thundered toward each other across the frozen ground. It was a winter tournament, the kind King Henry VIII lived for. At 44 years old, he was still desperate to prove he was the warrior King England needed. The kind of king who could father sons.
The kind who could never be challenged. But on this particular afternoon, something went catastrophically wrong. Henry's opponent struck him with a lance. The blow was clean, brutal, the kind of impact that doesn't just knock a man off balance. It ends him. Henry's massive frame, weighed down by over 100 pounds of steel armour, was thrown backward.
His horse, equally armoured and galloping at 30 miles per hour, lost its footing. Both came crashing down. The horse fell on top of the king.
Imagine the sound.
Metal crushing against bone.
The wet crack of ribs compressing under several tons of armoured weight.
The sudden, suffocating silence that followed. Because that's what witnesses remembered most.
The silence. The way the cheering stopped. The way the air itself seemed to freeze.
Henry VIII lay motionless in the dirt.
His face was grey. His eyes were closed.
Blood began pooling beneath the twisted metal of his leg armour.
For 2 full hours, the King of England did not move, did not breathe visibly, did not respond to his name.
The court stood paralysed. Physicians rushed to his side, but no one dared remove the armour. No one knew if moving him would finish what the fall had started.
Courtiers whispered frantic prayers. Some wept openly.
Because if Henry died here, in the mud of his own tiltyard, everything would unravel. England had no male heir, no succession plan. Only a 3-year-old girl named Elizabeth and a wife the king was already tiring of.
Anne Boleyn was 5 months pregnant.
She was carrying the son everyone desperately needed.
The prince who would secure her crown. The boy who would silence her enemies. But Anne wasn't at the tournament.
She was inside the palace.
And someone had to tell her what had just happened.
Someone had to walk into her chambers and say the words that would destroy everything.
Your husband is dying. The news reached her within minutes. And in that moment, in the terror that flooded her body, something inside Anne Boleyn broke.
Not metaphorically. Physically.
Because 5 days later, the son she was carrying would be dead too.
In Tudor England, a king's death didn't just mean mourning. It meant chaos, civil war, bloodshed. And as Henry VIII lay crumpled in the Greenwich dirt, every single person watching understood exactly what was at stake. There was no clear heir. Princess Mary had been declared illegitimate when Henry divorced her mother. Little Elizabeth was only 3 years old, born to a woman half the country still considered a mistress and a witch. If Henry died right now, England would tear itself apart fighting over the throne. The physicians worked in frantic silence. They couldn't remove his armour without risking further damage to his spine or crushed ribs. They couldn't determine if he was bleeding internally.
They could only watch, wait, pray,
and listen for breath sounds that barely came.
Meanwhile, word spread through the palace like wildfire. Courtiers abandoned their posts. Servants whispered in corridors.
Foreign ambassadors began drafting urgent letters to their kings. Everyone was calculating.
Who would seize power?
Who would survive the transition?
Who would be executed when the dust settled?
Because that's how succession worked in 1536. Winners lived, losers died.
Anne Boleyn's enemies started circling immediately.
The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, was already positioning himself for whatever came next. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, began considering his options.
Even Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet lady in waiting who'd been catching Henry's eye for months, suddenly seemed relevant in a way she hadn't before.
For 120 minutes, the entire English court existed in a state of suspended terror.
Nobody moved. Nobody spoke above a whisper.
Because if the king died, some of them would follow him to the grave within weeks.
Treason charges.
Fabricated plots. Convenient accidents. That's how power transferred in the Tudor court.
And Anne, 5 months pregnant, confined to her chambers, she was trapped in her own nightmare.
Every second that passed without news was agony.
Was he dead? Was he dying? Would she be crowned regent for Elizabeth? Or would Norfolk and the old Catholic family stage a coup? Would they kill her? Imprison her? Force her into a convent? The child in her womb was supposed to be her salvation. The prince everyone needed. But what good was a prince if there was no king to protect them both?
Then, after what must have felt like an eternity, Henry's eyes opened.
He gasped, coughed.
Blood spattered the inside of his helmet. His leg was shattered. The bone splintered beneath the armor.
The blow to his head had been catastrophic. Medical experts today estimate he suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, the kind that changes personality, triggers paranoia, causes rage and depression.
But he was alive.
The crisis was over. Also everyone thought, because 5 days later, on the same day England buried Catherine of Aragon, and Boleyn went into premature labour.
The son she was carrying, the boy who would have made her untouchable, was born dead.
And when Henry heard the news, he said something that would seal her fate.
To understand why Anne Boleyn's miscarriage was a death sentence, you need to understand what it meant to be a Tudor queen.
Your job wasn't to advise. It wasn't to be loved. It wasn't even to be loyal. Your job was singular, brutal, and non-negotiable.
Produce a male heir, or be replaced, and had already failed twice.
In 1534, she'd miscarried a child. The sex was never recorded because it happened too early.
Then, in 1535, another pregnancy that may have ended the same way, though the records are murky.
Whispers followed her through the palace corridors.
Speculation about her body, her womb, whether God was punishing Henry for abandoning Catherine, because that's what people believed. Divine judgment. If a queen couldn't produce sons, it meant heaven itself had rejected the marriage.
And Henry, superstitious and increasingly paranoid, was starting to believe it too.
England had never been ruled by a queen.
Not successfully. Not without civil war. The Tudor dynasty itself was barely 50 years old, built on conquest and blood, not ancient lineage.
If Henry died without a legitimate son, powerful families would wage war for the throne. Thousands would die.
Cities would burn. The kingdom would collapse into the same chaos that had defined the Wars of the Roses. And knew this.
Every woman in the Tudor court knew this. Catherine of Aragon had suffered 6 pregnancies and only one surviving child, Mary. It cost Catherine her marriage, her title, and ultimately her life. She died in January 1536, the same month Anne would lose her last chance.
The math was simple and merciless.
Anne was 29 years old, considered nearly past childbearing age by Tudor standards. She'd been queen for 3 years and had one living daughter. Henry was 44, his leg now permanently damaged from the jousting accident, his health deteriorating.
Time was running out for both of them.
And Henry's eyes were already wandering. Jane Seymour, pale and docile, was everything Anne wasn't. Quiet where Anne was sharp-tongued. Submissive where Anne was defiant.
Jane never argued, never challenged, never reminded Henry of his failures.
She was a blank canvas he could project his fantasies onto. The fantasy of a different marriage, a different queen, a different outcome.
Anne's enemies circled like wolves.
Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had never truly supported her.
Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, was calculating which way the political winds were blowing.
The old Catholic families who'd loved Catherine despised Anne as a usurper and a heretic. They were just waiting for an opening.
The child Anne was carrying in January 1536 was her shield, her salvation.
The only thing that could silence the whispers and secure her crown. If she gave Henry a son, she became untouchable. A prince would erase Elizabeth's gender, erase the miscarriages,
erase Jane Seymour's existence. One healthy boy, and Anne Boleyn would have died of old age. But she didn't have a boy, not a living one.
Because on January 29th, while all of England lowered Catherine of Aragon into her grave, and went into labour 3.5 months too early,
the physicians were summoned, the midwives prepared,
and when it was over, they wrapped a tiny body and carried it away. A son,
perfectly formed, dead.
Catherine of Aragon was being lowered into the earth at Peterborough Abbey when Anne Boleyn felt the first contraction. The timing was grotesque.
Poetic, even, if you believed in curses. The woman Henry had destroyed to make Anne queen was finally being buried. And at that exact moment, Anne's body was expelling the only thing keeping her alive.
The pain came in waves,
Not the manageable discomfort of early labour, but something violent and wrong. Her ladies rushed to her chambers.
Midwives were summoned. Physicians arrived, their faces already grave, because they knew what this meant. Everyone knew what this meant.
Anne was 15 weeks pregnant, far enough along that the child's sex would be obvious, not far enough for survival.
The baby would be born, but it would never take a breath.
Historical accounts describe what happened with clinical precision. Ambassador Eustace Chapis, writing to Charles the 11 days later, reported it coldly. On the day of the interment, the concubine had an abortion which seemed to be a male child, which she had not borne 3.5 months, at which the king has shown great distress. A male child.
The words that should have been Anne's salvation became her epitaph. Imagine being in that room.
The blood, the silence between the screams.
The moment when the midwives wrapped the tiny body in linen and refused to meet Anne's eyes, because they knew.
This wasn't just a miscarriage. This was a queen's execution notice, written in her own body's failure, and tried to explain it, tried to make Henry understand. She blamed the Duke of Norfolk for frightening her with news of the jousting accident 5 days earlier. The terror, she said, had done this.
The shock of thinking Henry was dead had killed their son.
It was a reasonable explanation. Stress and trauma absolutely can trigger premature labor. But Henry didn't care about reasonable explanations.
When he came to her chambers and saw the evidence of what she'd lost, something in him broke.
Or maybe it was the final piece of something already shattered. He looked at Anne, the woman he'd torn apart the Catholic Church to marry, and said words that would haunt her for the remaining 110 days of her life. I see that God will not give me male children. Not us. Not we. God will not give me male children.
As if Anne's body was the obstacle.
As if God himself had judged her defective and cursed.
The implication was clear. This marriage, like his marriage to Catherine, was wrong in God's eyes.
Sinful. Doomed.
And if the marriage was wrong and wasn't a queen,
she was an impediment. A mistake that needed correcting.
Henry left her chambers that day and went straight to Jane Seymour. By some accounts, he spoke to her within hours, began planning, perhaps, or simply seeking comfort from a woman whose body hadn't yet betrayed him, whose womb still held possibility instead of dead princes, and was left alone with her grief and her terror,
because she understood,
even if no one said it out loud yet, that she'd just lost more than a child.
She'd lost her shield,
her value, her reason for existing in Henry's world. The son who would have made her untouchable was gone, and the countdown to her execution had begun.
The historical record is brutal in its brevity. Eustace Chapis, the imperial ambassador and no friend to Anne Boleyn, wrote exactly 17 words about the child itself.
A male child, which she had not borne 3.5 months. That's it. That's the sum total of what we know from someone who was actually there, who had access to court gossip, who recorded everything.
17 words to describe the prince who could have changed everything. But silence breeds speculation, and speculation breeds horror. Within weeks, rumours began circulating about the fetus.
Whispers in dark corridors. Stories that grew more grotesque with each telling.
Some claimed the child was deformed. Others said it was barely recognisable as human.
The word monstrous appeared in later accounts, though never in contemporary ones.
Here's what we actually know. Anne was approximately 15 weeks pregnant when she miscarried.
At that stage of development, a male fetus would be roughly 3 to 4 inches long, recognisable,
fully formed in miniature.
Fingers, toes, facial features all present.
The sex would be obvious to anyone who looked.
The baby would have been wrapped immediately in linen.
Standard practice for royal miscarriages. No elaborate funeral, no public acknowledgement. Just a quiet disposal, because acknowledging the loss meant acknowledging the failure. And Tudor courts didn't memorialise failures. They buried them and pretended they never happened. But the rumours persisted.
Decades later, a Catholic propagandist named Nicholas Sander would claim the fetus was a shapeless mass of flesh. He wrote this in 1585, almost 50 years after Anne's death, as part of his campaign to discredit Elizabeth I's legitimacy.
He had no first-hand knowledge.
No evidence.
Just an agenda. Modern historians have dissected these claims and found them wanting. There's no contemporary evidence the fetus was deformed.
No medical records. No eyewitness accounts from people actually present. What we have instead is Chapis, who would have delighted in reporting any scandal about Anne, simply stating the facts.
Male,
15 weeks.
Dead. So why did the deformity myth spread? Because it served a purpose.
If the fetus was deformed, it proved God's judgment against Anne.
It validated Henry's decision to destroy her. It gave Jane Seymour's future children a narrative advantage. Look what God gave the witch versus what he gave the virtuous queen.
The truth is simpler and more tragic.
Stress-induced miscarriage is medically documented. A woman who believes her husband is dying, who's told he's been crushed under an armored horse, who spends hours not knowing if she's about to become a widow with no protection.
Her body could absolutely respond by expelling a pregnancy. There was nothing monstrous about Anne's son, except the timing of his death. He was a perfectly formed prince who died 3.5 months too early. Small enough to fit into hands, developed enough that everyone could see what England had lost.
A boy, an heir, the future King Henry IX, who would never take a breath, and the moment they wrapped his body and carried it away, and Boleyn's execution warrant was signed.
It would just take 100 days to be carried out.
And needed someone to blame. When Henry came to her chambers and stared at the evidence of what she'd lost, she couldn't just accept the silence. She couldn't let him walk away thinking this was her fault. Her body's failure, God's judgment against her.
So she gave him a reason.
A target, someone other than herself.
She blamed the Duke of Norfolk.
Her own uncle had been the one to bring her the news 5 days earlier.
That Henry had fallen, that he'd been crushed under his horse,
that he was unconscious and might be dying.
Norfolk had delivered those words with all the warmth of a man reading an execution notice.
Which, in a way, he was.
And told Henry the shock had done this.
That the terror of thinking he was dead had triggered the miscarriage.
That her body had betrayed her not because of divine punishment or physical weakness, but because of the unbearable stress of almost losing him. It was a brilliant deflection.
It made her the victim instead of the failure.
It painted her as so devoted, so emotionally connected to Henry, that the mere possibility of his death had physically destroyed her. It also conveniently blamed Norfolk, a man who'd never truly supported her queenship and who would happily watch her fall. And medically, she wasn't wrong. Extreme stress, particularly sudden traumatic news, can absolutely trigger premature labor.
The flood of stress hormones, the spike in blood pressure, the body's fight or flight response kicking into overdrive while pregnant can have catastrophic consequences. Modern obstetrics recognizes this.
Tudor medicine didn't have the terminology, but they understood the connection between shock and miscarriage.
But Henry didn't care about medical explanations. He didn't care about cortisol levels or sympathetic nervous system responses. He cared about results, about sons,
about whether God was blessing or cursing his marriage. And a dead prince, regardless of why he died, was a curse. Anne's explanation might have saved her in a different timeline, if Henry had still loved her the way he did when he tore apart the church to make her queen.
If Jane Seymour hadn't been waiting in the shadows.
If Anne had been 22 instead of 29. If Catherine of Aragon hadn't just been buried, creating this grotesque symmetry between the old queen's death and the new queen's failure. But this wasn't that timeline.
Henry looked at Anne, the woman he'd moved heaven and earth for, and saw only disappointment.
A womb that couldn't do the one thing he needed.
A wife who argued instead of submitting.
A queen who'd promised him sons and delivered a daughter and dead babies. He spoke the words that would haunt her final months.
I see that God will not give me male children. Not, we lost a child. Not, we'll try again. Not even anger or grief. Just cold calculation. A king reassessing his options.
A man who'd already started imagining a different future with a different wife.
And tried to argue.
To explain.
To make him understand. But Henry had already left the room emotionally, even if his body remained.
His mind was with Jane.
His thoughts were on annulment strategies.
His heart, if he'd ever truly given it to Anne, was packed away and locked.
The Duke of Norfolk would escape blame entirely. Jane Seymour would become queen within weeks of Anne's execution.
And Anne's explanation, her desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless, would be forgotten by everyone, except the historians who'd dissect her 4 centuries later.
She'd lost her son, and in that same moment, she'd lost her husband. She just didn't know yet that she'd also lost her head. 7 words.
That's all it took for Henry to condemn and Boleyn to death. He didn't shout them, didn't scream or rage or throw things the way he was known to do.
He spoke them quietly, coldly, standing in her chambers while she was still bleeding from the miscarriage.
Still in physical pain, still processing the loss of the son who was supposed to save her.
7 words that meant, this marriage is cursed. You have failed. I'm already planning your replacement. Anne would have heard the echo immediately.
Because those were the same words, the same logic, the same divine justification Henry had used to destroy Catherine of Aragon. Back then, he declaimed his first marriage was against God as law because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur. The proof, no surviving sons.
God's judgment made manifest through her womb.
Catherine had given Henry 6 pregnancies.
6 attempts, only Princess Mary survived.
And Henry had taken that as evidence that heaven itself opposed their union. He'd spent 7 years fighting the Pope, breaking from Rome, creating the Church of England, all to escape a marriage he claimed God had cursed with sonlessness. Now he was saying the exact same thing to Anne.
The woman he'd torn apart Christendom to marry. The woman he'd waited 7 years to bed legitimately. The woman who was supposed to be different, blessed, chosen by God to give him sons where Catherine had failed. 3 years of marriage, and Anne had delivered 1 healthy daughter and a trail of failed pregnancies. And Henry, superstitious and self-centered to his core, could only see one explanation.
Not his age, not his health,
not the jousting accident that had likely caused brain damage, not the stress he'd put Anne under, not the genetic reality that he was probably the source of the fertility problems.
No, God was punishing him for marrying Anne,
which meant Anne wasn't his wife. She was his sin.
His mistake, an obstacle between him and God's favour that needed to be removed. Henry left her chambers that day and went straight to Jane Seymour.
Within hours, he was sitting with her,
talking to her,
planning, perhaps, or simply taking comfort in a woman whose body hadn't yet disappointed him. Jane was everything and wasn't in that moment.
Untested, uncomplicated, docile and quiet, where Anne was sharp-tongued and proud.
Jane never argued, never challenged, never reminded Henry of his failures by her mere existence.
She was a blank slate he could project all his fantasies onto. The fantasy of a son,
of a blessed marriage, of starting over without the baggage of broken promises and dead babies.
The court watched and calculated.
Ambassadors sent urgent letters to foreign kings. Anne's enemies began circling openly now, emboldened by Henry's coldness. Even her supporters stepped back, sensing the shift in power, unwilling to go down with a sinking queen. Anne was still Queen of England,
still wore the crown, still sat on the throne beside Henry at state functions.
But she was already a ghost,
already erased from Henry's future, already condemned by the 7 coldest words a Tudor king could speak to his wife.
In less than 100 days, those words would become a death sentence carried out on Tower Green by a French swordsman's blade.
But Anne didn't know that yet. She just knew that Henry had looked at her with the same cold calculation he'd once used on Catherine. And every wife who'd ever been on the receiving end of that look had ended up cast aside, imprisoned, or dead, and had gambled everything on giving Henry a son.
And she'd lost. Now all that remained was the wait to see exactly how Henry would dispose of her. History is written by the victors and the survivors, and sometimes by people with axes to grind decades after everyone involved is safely dead and can't defend themselves.
And Boleyn's story didn't end with her execution.
It mutated, twisted,
became infected with lies that served the agendas of people who'd never met her, never lived through the events, never cared about truth. The most persistent myth is the one about her miscarried son being deformed. A shapeless mass of flesh is how it is described in texts that show up in history classes and historical novels. It sounds horrifying, sounds like divine judgment, sounds like proof that Anne was cursed, evil, a witch who'd seduced a king with dark magic.
There's just one problem. It's complete fabrication. The source is Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist writing in 1585. Almost 50 years after Anne died. He'd never been to England during her reign, never saw the fetus,
never spoke to anyone who did.
He was writing propaganda specifically to discredit Queen Elizabeth I by destroying her mother's reputation.
If Anne was a witch who bore monstrous children, then Elizabeth had no legitimate claim to the throne. Sander also claimed Anne had 6 fingers on one hand. Another complete lie that somehow became accepted fact for centuries.
She didn't. Court records, portraits, eyewitness accounts from people who actually knew her never mentioned this deformity because it didn't exist.
But the lie stuck because they were useful, because they painted Anne as something other than what she was. A woman destroyed by a king who needed a scapegoat for his own failures.
Then there's the witchcraft charge.
Ask anyone about Anne Boleyn's execution, and many will tell you she was accused of witchcraft, that Henry believed she'd used spells and sorcery to seduce him, that the court found her guilty of being a witch. None of this is in her actual indictment.
The charges were adultery, incest, and conspiring to murder the king.
Witchcraft isn't mentioned once in the legal documents. What exists is a third-hand report that Henry told someone he felt seduced and constrained by sword orgies after the fact. A convenient excuse for a king who needed to justify why he'd destroyed the Church of England to marry a woman he was now murdering. Other myths are smaller but equally persistent. That her head was displayed on a spike on London Bridge like a common traitor.
It wasn't. She was buried in the Tower Chapel, her body treated with at least minimal dignity, even if her reputation wasn't.
That she confessed her guilt before death. She didn't.
On the morning of May 19th, 1536, standing on the scaffold with the French swordsman waiting, Anne swore her innocence. She'd also sworn it the night before, on her soul's damnation, after receiving communion. In Tudor England, that was as sacred an oath as existed. Breaking it meant eternal hellfire.
Even Mark Smeaton, the only man who confessed to adultery with Anne, likely did so under torture or threat of torture. The other 4 men accused alongside her maintained their innocence to the moment the axe fell on their necks.
But innocent people executed don't serve the narrative as well as guilty ones.
A king who murders his wife for political convenience is a monster.
A king who executes a treasonous adulteress is doing his duty.
So the lies multiplied,
spread, became accepted history for generations.
The truth is simpler and darker.
And Boleyn lost a pregnancy.
Henry decided she'd outlived her usefulness.
Thomas Cromwell manufactured charges. A rigged trial condemned 6 innocent people. And then died not because of what she did, but because of what her womb failed to produce. Everything else is just decoration on a murder. Jane Seymour wasn't beautiful.
Contemporary accounts describe her as pale, plain-featured, with a long face and small eyes.
Where Anne Boleyn had been vivacious and sharp-tongued, Jane was quiet.
Where Anne had challenged Henry and debated theology, Jane submitted and agreed.
Where Anne had worn French fashions and sparkling jewels, Jane dressed conservatively and spoke in whispers. She was perfect. Henry had been burned twice now by passionate, complicated women.
Catherine had defied him for years, refusing to accept the annulment, dying with the title of Queen still on her lips. Anne had argued, schemed, refused to fade quietly into the background when her usefulness expired. Both had given him daughters instead of sons.
Both had, in his mind, been cursed by God. Jane offered him something different.
A blank canvas.
A woman with no agenda except pleasing him.
Someone who would never remind him of his failures, because she never challenged him in the first place.
She'd been a lady in waiting to both Catherine and Anne, watching from the shadows as queens rose and fell. She'd learned the lesson both women had failed to grasp.
In Henry's England, a queen's only job was to produce sons and stay silent.
Everything else was negotiable. Everything else was dangerous. Henry had noticed Jane as early as 1535, during a visit to her family home at Wolf Hall.
He'd sent her gifts, made his interest known.
And Jane, calculating or genuinely virtuous depending on which historian you believe, refused to become his mistress. She would be queen or nothing. That refusal was strategic brilliance.
Because Henry didn't need another mistress. He had plenty of those.
What he needed was a reason to dispose of Anne that would make him look like a monster. And Jane's insistence on marriage gave him that reason. If Jane wouldn't sleep with him outside of wedlock, then the current wedlock had to end. Permanently.
After Anne's miscarriage in January 1536, Henry moved quickly.
He installed Jane in apartments at Greenwich Palace.
Not hidden lodgings.
Not secret rooms.
Public apartments where the entire court could see her.
Where Anne could see her. The message was clear.
A new queen was being prepared.
Jane's family, the Seymours, began their ascent.
Her brothers Edward and Thomas suddenly had the king's ear. Positions opened for them. Feathers flowed.
The machinery of replacing one queen with another began grinding forward. And Jane stood at its centre, demure and silent, and exactly what Henry wanted.
She never had to say a word against Anne. Didn't need to scheme or plot or spread rumours. Her very existence was the threat.
Young where Anne was aging.
Untested where Anne had failed. Docile where Anne fought back. The court began taking sides.
Anne's supporters grew quieter. Sensing the shift, Jane's family grew bolder. And Henry, already convinced God had cursed his marriage to Anne, saw in Jane the possibility of redemption. A fresh start.
A womb that hadn't yet disappointed him. By April 1536, courtiers were openly betting on when Anne would fall.
The question wasn't if anymore. It was when, and how, and whether she'd go quietly or fighting. Jane Seymour didn't attend in Boleyn's execution on May 19th. She was waiting, 1 mile away in the lodgings Henry had provided, for news that she was free to become queen. The very same day Anne's head fell, Henry went to Jane.
By some accounts, he arrived by barge before noon, Anne's blood barely dry on the scaffold, to tell his next wife that she was needed now. They were betrothed the next day, married 11 days later.
And Jane, having watched 2 queens destroyed, knew exactly what she needed to do to survive.
Produce a son.
Stay silent.
And never, ever give Henry a reason to look at her the way he'd looked at Anne in those final, terrible months.
Thomas Cromwell was a blacksmith's son who declawed his way to the top of Tudor England through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to sense which way political winds were blowing.
He'd helped Henry divorce Catherine, helped him marry Anne, helped dismantle the Catholic Church in England and redistribute monastery wealth into the king's coffers. He'd made Anne Boleyn queen.
And now he was going to unmake her.
It wasn't personal.
It never was with Cromwell. It was survival. Because by early 1536, Anne had become a threat to him. Not because she hated him, but because she'd stopped being useful and started being dangerous. The breaking point came at Easter, when Anne's chaplain John Skipp delivered a sermon. It wasn't subtle.
Skipp compared Cromwell to Haman, the biblical villain who'd plotted against Queen Esther and ended up hanged on the gallows he'd built for someone else.
The message was clear. Cromwell was an evil counsellor leading the king astray.
And Anne was behind every word.
She'd attacked him publicly, in front of Henry, in front of the entire court.
It was a declaration of war from a queen who thought she was untouchable.
But Anne had miscalculated.
Because Thomas Cromwell didn't fight was. He couldn't win. And he'd already noticed something crucial. Henry was done with her.
The miscarriage had sealed it.
The cold words Henry had spoken.
The way he looked at Jane Seymour.
And didn't see it yet, blinded by her crown and her desperation. But Cromwell saw it clearly.
The king wanted out.
He just needed someone to build the exit.
So Cromwell started building.
Quietly.
Methodically.
Gathering threads of gossip and innuendo that had always swirled around Anne's court.
She was flirtatious, witty,
comfortable with male courtiers in ways that scandalized conservatives. None of it was criminal. All of it could be weaponized.
He started with Mark Smeaton, a court musician.
Low-born.
Vulnerable.
Exactly the kind of man who'd break under pressure. On April 30th, Cromwell invited Smeaton to his house. What happened there remains debated.
Torture, threats,
promises of mercy.
Whatever method Cromwell used, it worked. Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen. One confession opened the floodgates. Cromwell moved fast now, identifying other men who'd spent time alone with Anne.
Henry Noyes, the king's closest friend. William Brereton, a powerful courtier.
Francis Weston, young and reckless. And most damning of all, George Boleyn.
Anne's own brother. The charges Cromwell constructed were monstrous. Adultery.
Conspiracy to murder the king. Incest. It didn't matter that the timeline was impossible, that Anne was constantly surrounded by ladies in waiting, that the accused men were never alone with her in any meaningful way. Cromwell wasn't building a case. He was building a justification for what Henry had already decided.
On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested during a May Day tournament.
Taken to the Tower of London by barge, the same route she travelled for her coronation 3 years earlier. This time, there were no cheering crowds.
No celebrations.
Just silence and the waiting executioner's blade. Cromwell had done exactly what Henry needed.
He transformed a political problem into a treason case, turned an inconvenient wife into a treasonous whore, and he'd done it so efficiently, so thoroughly, that 4 innocent men would die alongside Anne just to make the story believable.
4 years later, Cromwell would learn what Anne had learned, that the man who builds the trap can end up in it.
Henry would turn on him too, using the same methods, the same rushed trial, the same convenient charges.
And Cromwell would mount the scaffold understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he'd done to Anne.
But that was later. In May 1536, Thomas Cromwell was at the height of his power, and Anne Boleyn had 19 days left to live.
Anne Boleyn was watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace when they came for her. It was May 2nd, a Tuesday afternoon, warm enough that courtiers had gathered outdoors for entertainment. The sound of the ball striking walls.
Laughter.
The mundane rhythms of court life continuing as if the world wasn't about to end.
A messenger approached.
Urgent. Formal. The King's Council required her presence immediately. No explanation. No time to prepare. Just the command and the walk through corridors that suddenly felt too long and too short at the same time. The council chamber held 3 men.
The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, whose face showed nothing.
Sir William Fitzwilliam. Sir William Paulet.
No friendly faces. No allies.
Just the machinery of royal justice waiting to crush her.
They told her the charges. Adultery.
Not with 1 man, but 3.
Mark Smeaton. Henry Noyes. Others whose names blurred together as Anne's world tilted sideways.
Smeaton had confessed, they said. Noyes had been arrested. The evidence was overwhelming. The Queen had betrayed her husband and her kingdom, and knew immediately it was over, not because the charges were true. They weren't, but because Henry had authorized this. Her husband, the man she'd married 3 years ago in secret ceremony, the man whose child she'd lost just 3 months earlier, had ordered her arrest on charges carrying a death sentence. She tried to defend herself, tried to explain. But you don't defend yourself to men who've already decided your guilt. The council wasn't there to investigate. They were there to inform her that she'd been judged and found wanting. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Anne was on a barge headed down the Thames toward the Tower of London, the same river route she'd travelled for her coronation. Then, the banks had been packed with cheering crowds. Musicians played, banners flew. She'd worn cloth of gold and sat beneath the canopy like a goddess. Now, the barge was silent except for the splash of oars. No crowds, no music, just the cold May water and the growing shadow of the White Tower as they approached. Anne entered through the Queen's stairs, not the Traitor's Gate. A small mercy. She was under arrest for treason, but she was still an anointed queen, still entitled to certain privileges. She would be housed in the royal apartments, not the dungeons, the same rooms she'd occupied for her coronation 3 years ago. When she stepped off the barge and saw where she was, and collapsed, the irony was too much, the symmetry too perfect. She was back where her reign had begun, and this time she wouldn't leave alive. She asked about her father, about her sweet brother George. Were they safe? Had they been arrested too? The guards gave her nothing, just silence and the long walk to the apartments that had once meant triumph and now meant death. Inside those rooms, Anne was assigned 4 women to attend her, not her chosen ladies. Women selected by Cromwell, women whose job was to watch her, report every word she spoke, every tear she shed, every moment of weakness that could be used against her. Anne understood the game now. Everything she said would be twisted into evidence. Every conversation would be weaponized. Even her grief, even her fear, would be used to justify what Henry had already decided. She had 17 days left to live. 17 days in gilded rooms that had become her prison. 17 days to understand that the charges didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. Innocence didn't matter. Henry wanted her dead. And in Tudor England, what the king wanted, the king received. The indictment against Anne Boleyn reads like horror fiction written by someone who didn't care about plot holes. Adultery with 5 men. Incest with her brother. Conspiracy to murder the king. Each charge more lurid than the last. Each one designed to shock, disgust, and justify what had already been decided. But here's the problem. The timeline was impossible. Thomas Cromwell's prosecutors claimed Anne had committed adultery at specific dates and locations. Hampton Court on October 6th, Westminster on November 12th, Greenwich on December 8th. They listed times, places, witnesses. It should have been airtight, except historians who've examined the records discovered something damning. 3/4 of the dates listed in the indictment don't work. On some of those days, Anne wasn't at the location claimed. On others, the man she supposedly slept with was somewhere else entirely. The court records show her whereabouts. The household accounts track where courtiers were. The two didn't match. It didn't matter, because proving innocence requires someone to care about proof. The charge of adultery with Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the foundation everything else rested on. He'd confessed, probably after hours in Thomas Cromwell's house, facing methods we can only imagine. Torture wasn't technically legal for commoners in treason cases, but Cromwell wasn't bound by technicalities. Whatever happened in that room, Smeaton broke. He gave Cromwell the confession that made everything else possible. The other men never confessed. Henry Noyes, the king's closest friend, maintained his innocence, even when offered life if he'd just admit guilt. Francis Weston, young and terrified, denied everything. William Brereton, politically powerful and dangerous to Cromwell, refused to give them the satisfaction. And George Boleyn, Anne's brother, faced perhaps the most grotesque charge of all, incest. The indictment described it in pornographic detail designed to make the jury recoil. Kissing with tongues, seduction with jewels and gifts, violations too obscene to speak aloud in polite company. The evidence? George had spent time alone with his sister. They were close. They talked. They laughed together. In any normal family, this would be unremarkable. In Cromwell's courtroom, it became proof of unspeakable sin. There was also a secret charge, one only revealed during George's trial. A note passed to him claiming Henry was impotent, that he lacked sexual prowess, that Elizabeth might not be his daughter. George was instructed not to read it aloud. He read it anyway, damning himself by speaking the unspoken truth about the king's failures in public. Anne was also charged with conspiring to kill Henry,
with planning which of her lovers she'd marry after the king's death, with never having loved him. These weren't legal crimes.
You can't prosecute someone for their feelings, but in Tudor England, you could execute a queen for anything if the king wanted it. The trial was held on May 15th in the King's Hall at the Tower. 2,000 spectators packed in to watch.
Anne wore black velvet and faced 27 peers who would decide her fate. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided. Her former betrothed, Henry Percy, sat in judgment. She defended herself brilliantly,
Answered every charge with clarity and logic.
admitted only to giving Francis Weston money, something she did for many courtiers. Contemporary accounts describe her as speaking so wisely, so clearly, that observers believed she'd proven her innocence.
The jury voted guilty anyway, unanimously,
because they weren't judging evidence.
They were confirming what Henry had already ordered. The Queen's apartments at the Tower of London were the most luxurious prison cells in England.
Tapestries on the walls, leaded glass windows, furniture befitting a monarch.
3 years ago, Anne had stayed in these exact rooms preparing for her coronation.
She'd been dressed in white and gold. Musicians had played beneath her windows.
The city had celebrated her rise.
Now she was back, and the only music was the sound of her own breathing.
The cruelty of the location wasn't accidental.
Henry could have housed her anywhere in the tower, the dungeons,
A simple cell. But he chose to put her back in the rooms where she'd reached the peak of her power, where she'd been untouchable, where the future had stretched out before her like a golden road leading to sons and security, and a long reign as England as queen.
Every corner held a memory.
The window where she'd waved to crowds,
The chair where she'd sat for fittings. The bed where she'd slept the night before becoming queen, too excited to rest, dreaming of the son she'd give Henry and the dynasty they'd build together.
Now that bed was where she lay awake at night calculating how many days she had left, and wasn't alone.
She'd been assigned 4 women to attend her.
Not her chosen ladies, not friends or allies.
These were Cromwell's selections.
Women instructed to watch her, listen to her, report every word back to the council,
Every tear, every prayer.
every moment of weakness or strength that could be used as evidence.
Mrs. Coffin, Mrs. Stone, Lady Boleyn, her aunt by marriage who'd never liked her, and Lady Kingston, wife of the Tower Constable. These women would be Anne's only human contact for 17 days, and they were her jailers as much as her companions.
Anne talked constantly during those first days, nervous energy.
Terror manifesting as words that tumbled out uncontrolled.
She asked about her father.
About George, about the men accused alongside her.
She insisted on her innocence, tried to make sense of the charges, laughed sometimes, hysterical laughter that came from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Everything was recorded. The women reported it all to Sir William Kingston, who wrote it down and sent it to Cromwell.
Anne's fear,
Her confusion,
her desperate attempts to understand why Henry was doing this.
all of it became evidence in a trial where innocence didn't matter. The windows overlooked Tower Green.
The patch of grass where executions happened for prisoners of rank.
Anne could see it from her apartments,
Could watch as carpenters began building something there. A scaffold.
low to the ground, barely elevated, just high enough for spectators to see the blade fall.
They were building it for her. At night, the tower was silent except for the guards changing shifts.
The river lapping against the walls.
The occasional scream from prisoners in actual cells who didn't have tapestries or furniture or windows with views of their own execution site.
Anne would pace, pray, try to sleep and fail, calculate whether Henry might change his mind,
Whether someone would intervene.
whether her trial would actually care about truth or evidence, or the fact that she did nothing wrong.
But deep down, in the place she didn't want to examine and knew.
The apartments were comfortable because Henry could afford to be generous with a woman who was already dead. The trial would be a formality. The verdict was already written.
She was back where her reign began, trapped in luxury, waiting for the day they'd take her outside to that patch of grass and end the story the way Henry had decided it should end.
2,000 people packed into the King's Hall at the Tower of London on May 15th.
They came to watch a queen defend herself against charges of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder.
But really, they came to watch a public execution that just happened to involve a trial first. Anne entered wearing black velvet.
Dark as morning, dark as the verdict everyone already knew was coming. She faced a jury of 27 peers, men who should have been her equals, but were really her executioners in fancy robes. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat as Lord High Steward.
The man who'd brought her the news of Henry's jousting accident. the man whose family had risen alongside Anne's. Now he'd preside over her death sentence, because that's how you survived in Tudor England. Family loyalty ended where royal favour began. The charges were read. The pornographic details of alleged adultery, the conspiracy to kill the king, the incest with her brother described in language designed to shock, disgust, make the jury recoil from the monster standing before them in black velvet, and answered every charge, not with tears or hysteria or the breakdown they probably expected. She defended herself with clarity and logic that stunned the observers. Charles, riotously watching from the crowd, wrote that she made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly, as though she had never been faulty to the same. She admitted only to giving money to Francis Weston, something she did for many young courtiers, something that wasn't a crime. She denied everything else with such composure, such intelligence, that people watching believed she'd proven her innocence. It didn't matter. The jury voted, unanimously, guilty on all charges, every single one of them, because 4 men had already been convicted of adultery with the Queen. If Anne was innocent, their verdicts were wrong, and admitting those verdicts were wrong meant admitting the king was wrong. No one in that room was brave enough or stupid enough to suggest Henry VIII had made a mistake, and was stripped of her titles, everything except Queen, because you needed to be a queen to have committed treason against the king's bed. Norfolk, tears streaming down his face, pronounced the sentence. Because thou hast offended against our sovereign the king's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attainted of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death, and thy judgment is this, that thou shalt be burned here within the Tower of London on the Green, else to have thy head smitten off, as the king's pleasure shall be further known of the same, burned alive or beheaded, whichever Henry preferred. As if he was choosing between dinner options instead of deciding how to kill his wife. And didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't collapse. She stood there and listened to her death sentence delivered by her uncle with theatrical tears that meant nothing. And then she spoke. I believe there was some other reason for which I am condemned than the cause alleged. Not a defence, not a plea for mercy, just the truth spoken out loud in a room full of people who already knew it. Henry wanted her dead. The charges were window dressing. The trial was theatre, and everyone present understood exactly what they were participating in. Meanwhile, 1 mile away, Jane Seymour received a message from the king. He told her Anne would be condemned by 3 o'clock. He sent this message before the trial even concluded, before the jury voted, before Norfolk pronounced sentence, because the verdict had been written weeks ago. The trial was just paperwork. They made him wait. 2 days after her trial, 2 days after hearing her death sentence, they took the men out first, to Tower Hill, to the scaffold built for public executions, and depending on which account you believe, Anne may have watched. 5 men walked out of the Tower on the morning of May 17th. George Boleyn, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton. They'd been condemned for adultery with the Queen and conspiracy to murder the king, crimes they hadn't committed, but the law had spoken, and now the axe would follow. George went first, as the highest in rank. He was spared watching his friends die. Small mercy. He climbed the scaffold and delivered a speech so long, so theological, so pointed that it felt like a sermon from a man who knew this was his last chance to speak truth. He acknowledged he deserved death. Every condemned person said that. It was expected, traditional. But George went further. He told the crowd he'd read God's word but hadn't followed it. That if he had, he'd still be alive. He urged them to stick to the truth, to follow it, not just read it. It was as close to declaring his innocence as a dying man could get without actually saying the words. Then he knelt, placed his head on the block still wet with morning dew. Then the axe fell. Henry Norris followed, the king's closest friend, the man who'd served Henry faithfully for years. According to witnesses, Norris said almost nothing at all, didn't confess to adultery, didn't beg for mercy, just knelt and died with whatever truth he knew locked inside his skull. Francis Weston was third, young, wealthy, from a powerful family that couldn't save him. He warned people to learn from his example, though what example remained unclear since he'd done nothing wrong. Then he too placed his head on the block, now slick with the blood of his friends. William Brereton was fourth. He spoke of offending God and the king, said he deserved 1,000 deaths, but added a crucial phrase that echoed what Anne had said at her trial. The cause wherefore I die, judge not, but if ye judge, judge the best. Translation: I'm dying for reasons that have nothing to do with the charges. Mark Smeaton was last, the only one who'd confessed. the musician whose torture or coercion in Cromwell's house had started this entire machinery of death. He didn't retract his confession on the scaffold.
Didn't exonerate Anne.
Just died. And when Anne heard he'd remained silent, she said something that broke through her composure. Alas,
I fear his soul will suffer for it. 5 heads. 5 bodies. 4 buried in the churchyard like commoners.
George's body carried inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, laid before the high altar because he was nobility. The same day, Archbishop Cranmer declared Anne's marriage to Henry null and void, as if it had never happened, as if Elizabeth was a bastard.
As if 3 years of queenship could be erased with a legal document. Anne was in her apartments when it happened.
Could she hear the crowd?
The thud of the axe. Did someone tell her George was dead?
That the 5 men condemned alongside her had already paid the price for her supposed sins. She had 2 days left. 2 days knowing that everyone accused with her was already gone. 2 days to prepare for her own walk to the scaffold on Tower Green. They'd killed the supporting cast.
Now it was time for the Queen. And Boleyn woke at 2 in the morning on May 19th, 1536. She'd been told her execution would happen at 8. Dawn was still hours away, so she prayed,
took communion from the Tower chaplain, swore on her soul's damnation that she was innocent, and waited for the sun to rise on her last day alive. 8 o'clock came and went.
The execution was delayed.
The scaffold wasn't ready.
The crowd hadn't assembled.
And had to keep waiting, dressed for death, knowing that every minute was borrowed and every breath could be her last.
When Sir William Kingston finally came for her at 9, she was ready.
She dressed carefully.
Ermine trim to confirm her status as queen.
A crimson kirtle, the colour of martyrs.
An English gable hood covering her hair. She looked like what she was, a queen walking to her execution with dignity intact.
The walk from her apartments to Tower Green was short.
Maybe 100 yards.
200 people waited, carefully selected. This wasn't a public spectacle. This was controlled, private. The first time England had ever executed a queen, and Henry wanted the story told his way.
And climbed the low scaffold.
Barely elevated, just high enough for the crowd to see.
She gave her final speech, and it was a masterpiece of survival strategy disguised as submission.
She praised Henry as a gentle and merciful prince, said she'd been judged by the law and wouldn't speak against it, asked God to save the king. She didn't confess.
Didn't admit guilt, but she also didn't condemn Henry, because 3-year-old Elizabeth was still alive and vulnerable. Every word and spoke on that scaffold was chosen to protect her daughter from the aftermath. Then she removed her headdress.
Her ladies tied a blindfold around her eyes,
and she knelt. The executioner was a French swordsman, specially imported from Calais, Henry's final gift to the wife he was murdering.
A sword was faster than an axe.
Cleaner, more merciful.
The swordsman was an expert.
He wouldn't miss,
and knelt, blindfolded, praying aloud.
O Lord, have mercy on me.
To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. The swordsman called out to his assistant.
Bring me the sword. It was a trick.
A distraction. The sword was already in his hand. Anne's head turned instinctively toward the sound, exposing her neck in the perfect position.
1 stroke.
Clean. Instant.
Her head fell.
Some witnesses claimed her lips were still moving when the executioner lifted it and showed it to the crowd.
Behold the head of a traitor. No one cheered.
Her ladies wept as they gathered her body and head, wrapping them in linen.
They'd prepared no coffin for a queen. She was buried in an old oak chest, steps away in the chapel of St.
Peter ad Vincula.
No ceremony.
No bells.
No mourning. That same day, Henry announced his engagement to Jane Seymour.
Within 11 days, he'd marry her. Within 17 months, Jane would give him the son and never could and die doing it.
And Boleyn was 29 years old. She'd been queen for 3 years.
And she died because on January 29th, 1536, she miscarried the only thing that could have saved her life.
A son.
A prince.
The future that never happened.